Hey, my name is Kaleb Crabtree, and I'm so glad that you decided to click on this video. This is a message from our youth group this past Sunday night that we call Grace Student. I pray that God uses it specifically in your life to touch your heart and to move you forward in faith. So enjoy it.
More freedom, whether you're in junior high, high school, you look at your life and you're like, I want a little more freedom. I want a little bit more freedom in my curfew and the things that I get to do, and I want a little bit more freedom in the things that I get to choose, and I just want to be able to kind of make my decisions. I want to be able to do my thing. I want to be able to have freedom, and we all are in this search for freedom, and we want to talk about what freedom really looks like, because oftentimes the unfortunate reality is that we're looking for freedom in the sense of our understanding of it, but what Christ is defining, what the biblical definition of freedom is far different than our understanding of it. And let me ask you as we start tonight, have you ever done something, and you just by show of hands, have you ever done something to try to impress somebody? To try to win somebody's approval? You ever try to just show of hands? Some of y'all ain't being honest. But have you ever done something to try to get somebody to like you? I can't even begin to say the number of times that I have done something with the intent to try to get somebody to like me or approve of me or accept me or whatever it is. Maybe you've done this. Have you ever pretended to like a certain band or artist or somebody, a singer or whatever, just because you're trying to impress your crush? You've ever done that? You ever done that? You're crushing on somebody, so you're like, oh, I totally am a Taylor Swift fan. You know what I mean? The guys know what I'm talking about. You're like, I'm feeling 22. You know what I mean? Because I like you, girl. You know. But you're trying to get somebody to like you. You got a crush on a girl. You got a crush on a guy, and you're trying to impress them because you like this person. But then you get found out when you're sitting across the table, and they're like, well, what's your favorite song? You're like, I don't know. Yeah. Then you look like a complete fool. Or maybe anybody ever tried to get a group of friends to like you? A group of people at school? Where you were like trying to win the approval of these people, and so you start dressing a certain way. Anybody like change their outfits because you're like, I'm trying to fit in with these people? You start changing maybe the way you dress, or maybe you just started acting in a way that's really not like how you actually act or what you know to be right or the way that you know you should live. And what you're doing is you're trying to win what? The approval of people. You're trying to win the approval. Or maybe you've done it with a parent or a team. Anybody tried to win the approval of your parents or your team or your coach or whatever? Maybe you have, your mom was the captain of captain of her cheerleading squad, and so you only tried out for cheerleading because mom wants you to do cheerleading, and she's just living her, like she's just trying to live her cheerleading dreams through you. Or maybe you are a football player because your dad was a football player, and you're trying to live through their dreams for you. And so you try out, you do all these things to try to get the approval of somebody else. I remember when I was in high school constantly changing the things that I would wear, the things that I would do, the way that I would talk, the music that I would listen to, all to try to do what? Win the approval of people, to try to get their approval. And here's the reality, right? Trying to get other people to like you is a normal thing, right? Is that fair? Like we all want people to like us. Who doesn't like to be liked by other people? Like, if we're being honest. Very few of us really, we want to be liked. We want to be included. We want to get the approval of other people. We all want to look as best as we can in front of others. Is that fair? We all want that in our lives. Some of you're shaking your head, whatever. Well, you may think that sounds crazy, but we all do it in ways in our lives all the time. So sometimes you might feel like as a teenager, 90% of everything that you're doing is just trying to get other people to like you in some way, shape, or form. And here's the thing. That doesn't change when you're an adult. Fair? It doesn't change when you're an adult. Then you're just trying to get the approval of bosses or coworkers or neighbors or whatever it is. And we all get to this point where we do so many things to do what? Seek approval. And can we just be honest tonight? Can we be honest? That's exhausting. Fair? It's an exhausting way to live, to constantly try to just get the approval of other people, to try to get their opinions of you to be what it is that you want them to be. And no matter how good you are at it, you constantly feel dissatisfied and never feeling like you have got what it was that you needed out of people. And usually at the end of the day, you feel exhausted trying to keep up with this image of yourself that you've created to get them to approve of you. Doesn't matter how good you are at the sport, you feel like you still are not meeting your coach's expectations. No matter how good you're doing in school, you feel like you're maybe not meeting your parents' expectations. We just live in this all the time. And that's a very disappointing feeling, isn't it? Disappointment in life is inevitable, but at the end of the day, we get caught up in this hamster wheel of trying to just win the approval of other people. Let me say this. Trying to win the approval of other people is the opposite of freedom. Fair? That's the opposite of freedom. If freedom is the ability for us to act without restriction, then write this down. Working for the approval of others means living restricted lives by the expectations that others put on us. If freedom is if freedom is the ability to act without restriction, then working for the approval of other people means living a life that has all these restrictions that are not even necessarily there because you're trying to live up to these expectations that other people are putting on you. And what we wanted to talk about in this series is, what does it look like to actually be free? We all want it. We all want that freedom, and God wants the same thing for you, but it's maybe a little bit different than you and I understand it. But what do we do? This is the question that we're going into tonight. What do we do if the fight for approval takes up our entire lives and it keeps us from feeling anything but free? We're going to go back to the book of Galatians tonight. Everybody say Galatians. Galatians. We started there last week. It's a book that the Apostle Paul wrote to the people of Galatia. There's a tension in the church because Paul had taught them a true gospel, and after he left, there are others that come in, and they begin to teach something different. And what Paul's message basically was, in short terms, was this: Jesus Christ saved you. Amen? Jesus Christ saved you, and you are free from the pressure of trying to keep all of these religious obligations of the law to be right with God. Jesus Christ saved you. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. You get to live in the freedom of Christ because he died on what? A cross. That's the message that Paul was presenting. And then there's these other guys that are coming into the church in Galatia. This is where the tension arises. And they're saying, no. Hold on. That's not the truth. Actually, you have to kind of keep all of these different Jewish laws and commands and rules and obligations and things in order for to actually be right with God. You have to do all of these things. And they're dismissing Paul's message, which is, no, Jesus Christ has saved you from all of the wrongdoing that you've done, so that the law, not that it's you shouldn't try to keep the rules and things like that, but at the end of the day, those aren't the things that save you, just living by a list of rules and doing those things right. Now, if you preach that message, and that message is true, and that's the message that Jesus Christ is about, and you leave the place, and you leave the church, as Paul did, and you're kind of following up with him, and you find out that somebody has came in and preached something that's completely contradictory and not true, and it's wrecking the people that you love so much, how would you feel if you're Paul? You'd be ticked. You'd be upset. It would not be the way that you would want you would want things to go. You had just spent time giving them this truth. And so we're going to look at this opportunity here where we're going to look at what Paul says. Paul wrote this in his letter to the Galatians. He says this. Galatians chapter 1, verse 6 and 7 says this: I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some are throwing you into confusion, and they're trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. Now, is it fair to say that's pretty blunt words? I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the truth that you know, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the truth of his life, and you're just turning to a gospel that's not even anything that's true at all. It's completely false. It's completely not true. Those are pretty blunt words, and they're probably, check this out, they're probably not the words that you would write to a group of people if you were trying to win their approval. Fair? You wouldn't say, no, look, you are abandoning truth, and you are completely following something that's false. You probably wouldn't talk that way if you're trying to win the approval of people, but Paul just says it straight up. And he goes on in verse 10, says this, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people, Paul says, were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. So what Paul's basically saying here is I'm going to probably not necessarily make you happy with the words that I'm saying. It's probably not what you want to hear. But I'm going to set the record straight. And I'm not here to win your approval. I'm here to present the truth. I'm here to give the actual gospel. Here's the truth about the life of Paul. Some of you guys would know this. Paul didn't need any more enemies. How many of you know who we're talking about? The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul. Raise your hand. Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul didn't need any more enemies. The Apostle Paul had plenty of enemies. He was on the run for his life through the majority of the New Testament. Everything that we read that he was writing somewhat on the run. The Roman government was out to get him because they didn't like him. Jewish and religious leaders were out to get him because he had walked away from this false gospel that he was living in, and now he's living in truth. If anyone, check this out, if anyone had the excuse to just try to get the approval of a few people, it would be the Apostle Paul. Because nobody really seemed to be on his side. But this is the thing about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul was not trying to build some team of people who just gave him their stamp of approval. He was on mission for Jesus. And if you don't know this tonight, living on mission for Jesus is not always going to get you the approval of people. It's not always going to get you liked in the crowd of people that you're maybe desiring to be liked by at school. Giving people the truth of the gospel is not going to be a message that people always want to hear, but it's the one that you're called to present. And so the Apostle Paul lived a life where he's saying this, I am interested in getting the message of Jesus to everyone. That's what my life is about. I'm not about seeking the approval of people, because if I was about seeking the approval of people, I would not be a servant of Jesus. I would be living a terrible life. So he's writing to this church in Galatia not to try to win people over, but to make sure that the message of Jesus wasn't lost in all of this crap that people are coming in and teaching that is not the gospel at all. Are y'all tracking with me? He's coming in to say, no, that's not true. And regardless of what they say, that is not true. A relationship with Jesus is not just a long list of things that you have to do in order to be right with God. A relationship with Jesus is, I believe in Jesus Christ, and he has died for me. He has crucified my sin on a cross, and it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who gets to live in me. I don't have to be bore down and weighed down and dead to my sin anymore. I can have a relationship with Jesus and a right relationship with God through Jesus. Now, what you have to understand is that's going to change the way that you live your life. You can't just keep going and living the way that you were living before. But it's not about all these long lists of things that it is about to be right with God. The list of things is, do I believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of the living God, and I believe that he has died for my sins. He's not trying to win the approval of people. He's taking a risk, presenting truth. He's saying things that jeopardize relationships potentially and maybe risk hurting some feelings. Is that fair? You go and tell somebody that at your school, and that might not necessarily be the way that they love to hear things. Hey, your beliefs, you're not necessarily believing something that's really true. Think that's going to really get you liked? But the message of Jesus was on the line. And the message of Jesus is a message where freedom from sin is something that we can have access to. Freedom from our sin and from our bondage. The freedom from having to try to win the approval of people in this long list of things that they want us to do to be accepted and liked. Paul wrote these words at the very start of the letter to Galatians because he wanted to make sure, to letter to the church in Galatia, because he wanted to make sure the clear intention was communicated. Let's look at it one more time. Verse 10, chapter 1, it says this, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. Because if pleasing people were my goal, I would not be Christ's servant. There's no way for you and I to get around that. Winning the approval of people is not your goal if you are a follower of Jesus. Seeking the approval of God is. Not living for man, but living for the Lord. Check this out. Maybe you want to write this down. Paul was more concerned with what God had to say than what people had to say. If you are really evaluative of your life tonight, do you care more about what God has to say than what people have to say? You don't have to answer the question out loud, but really ask yourself that question. Do I care more about what God has to say than what people have to say? Let me say it this way. Write this down as well. Going after the approval of God does not mean losing the respect of other people. You can still sit at people's seats and speak in a way that is loving and kind and gracious. You can still speak truth in a way that still allows you to have a seat at their table. Going after the approval of God does not mean that you have to go and be some religious jerk. You can still be a kind and loving person, but you can say truth boldly. Y'all tracking with me? There are too many Christians that live lives where, I'm going after the approval of God, but I treat people pretty crappy. And that's no way to live. Paul cares more about the relationship. When you think about it, Paul cares about, when he addresses the church in Galatia, he addresses them as brothers and sisters, is what the text says. Meaning, he obviously had a relationship with them. He cared about them. He loved them. But he said what he said because he cared about him, because he loved him. Regardless of how hard it hit their ears, regardless of what they thought about him at the end of that conversation, Paul cared about what they thought about God and how they saw God in a relationship with God. And so, at the expense of maybe hurting a few feelings, he said some things that were bold, and he presented the truth. There's a difference between, let me say this, there's a difference between caring about something and being controlled by something. There's a difference between us being, caring about something and being controlled by something. Paul cared about the Galatian church. Let me try to put it this way. Paul cared about the Galatian church. He wasn't controlled by the Galatian church. He wasn't controlled by their opinions. Let's put it this way. You can care about people at your school, but that does not mean you need to be controlled by their acceptance of you. Are you tracking with me? You can care about people, you can love people, you can care about people, but you don't have to be controlled by people's opinions, the things that they say, the things that they think. But you can still in your own life care about the influence that you get to have in theirs. Paul cared, let me write this down. He cared about having influence with the Galatian church, but he was not controlled by a need for their approval. And so he's going to say what he needs to say in alignment with the will of God, regardless of how hard it is. There's a small difference between being controlled by people and having an influence with them. Let me just say this as we start to get closer to the end. Write this down. You have the freedom, because we're talking about freedom, right? Everybody say freedom. You can say it louder. Say freedom. You have the freedom to make God's approval your first priority. In all things in your life, whether it's with people, whether it's with your parents, whether it's with teachers, coaches, whatever, friends, neighbors, you have the freedom to make God's approval your first priority. Now, here's the reality. That's a lot easier to say than to actually live out. Let me give you a couple examples. If you're willing to say things about other people or do things with other people that you know you shouldn't do and you wouldn't do if you were alone, and it goes against that kick in your spirit of should I do this or should I say this or should I act this way, you think, man, I should stop talking in this conversation. I should stop talking about this person, man. I should stop. We should. This all should stop. This doesn't need to go on anymore. And there's this kick in your spirit that's saying this isn't a right way to talk about people. This isn't a right conversation at the lunch table. This isn't the right way to do this. These aren't the right jokes to participate in. Man, I shouldn't be laughing at this. I shouldn't be participating in this. If you've got that kick in your spirit, but you do it anyways, here's the reality. You're probably controlled by the approval of other people more than you think you are. Let me put it this way. If your emotions in your entire day or your entire week are determined by what the coach thinks of you or what your teacher thinks of you or the way that a group of friends responds to you or the way that your teammates act towards you, to the way that you play, the way that you perform, and it changes how you feel about you. Anybody ever been that way? It changes how you feel about you. Here's the reality. You might be controlled by the approval of other people. Let me say one more. If you find yourself more judgmental of others and less accepting and including of other people, and you send them to the outside, and you distance yourself from people, and you find yourself thinking that you're better, thinking that you're cooler, or that you're more likable, or whatever it is, you think that you're just straight up better than certain people. You might care more about what others think than what God thinks. Is that fair? Are you tracking with me? We constantly, in a number of ways, live for the approval of other people, and we don't even always know that we're doing it. Like when I said at the beginning, like how many of you live for the approval of people, it's about 50% of the room. The reality is probably more like 95% of us are living in some capacity for the approval of other people in some way in our lives. And sometimes we're so numb to it, we don't even realize it because it's this hamster wheel of life. Here's why not living for the approval of people, I'm starting to get to the end. This is why not living for the approval of people matters. Here's why, write this down. Living for the approval of other people will eventually start to control you, and being controlled is the opposite of freedom. So you think you're more free because you're trying to, you got the approval of this group of people, but the reality is you're more controlled than than they got you right where they want you. The enemy's got you right where he wants you because you're not living in the freedom of Christ. You're living in the control of other people. Human opinions that, by the way, it's just going to be exhausting. Because as soon as you get approved by somebody, there's going to be something else that they want you to do in order to be approved by them the next day. And when you live for the approval of other people, what ends up happening is you actually end up more controlled than you really think you are in the beginning. And here's the reality. God doesn't want that for you. It's a miserable way for you to live, miserable way for me to live. It changes the way that we see God seeing us. We see things a different way. We wrap our heads around things where we're just trying to constantly do things to be approved. And it changes the way that we live because we're constantly trying to win the approval of people. True freedom is recognizing this. God's thoughts about you never change. God's approval of you never changes. God's acceptance of you never changes. Let me just tell you this truth tonight. Here's the reality. Jesus accepts you right where you are, right as you are, right in the midst of whatever struggle it is in your life. And he approves of you, and he loves you, and he accepts you. Acceptance in culture, though, is like, I'm just going to let people do whatever they want, be however they want to be. Love is love. You do you. Truth is relative. That's not true acceptance. Christ accepts you, but check it out. He doesn't accept the sin within you. And he loves you enough to have crucified it on a cross and died for it so that you didn't have to. That's how much he accepts you, and he approves you, and he loves you. And his death on the cross proves just how much he loves you, just how much he cares for you. Check out what Paul says, because here's the thing. If you know that you're accepted by God, regardless of what's going on in your life, you are approved by God. He loves you. He cares for you. And he was willing to take a cross for you. And he loves you and he approves of you. Then you understand, knowing that you're already accepted makes living for God something that you and I get to do and not live in the burden of constantly trying to feel accepted like we do with other people. Check out what Paul says, Galatians chapter 6, verse 4 and 5 says this. Be careful, pay careful attention to your own work. Then you will get the satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare. Check it out. You won't need to compare yourself to anyone else, for we are each responsible for our own conduct. Check this out. Living for God's approval, and I'm almost done. I'm going to pray. Living for God's approval means that you are freely accepted, and in your freedom, you should live a life that honors God. Live a life that is pleasing to God. Paul's not saying don't care about other people. He's just saying that God's view of you doesn't change. And working for the approval of God is all that matters. And if you and I lose sight of that, we're going to get exhausted and insecure in the work of trying to work to get the approval of other people. Write this down, last point. You don't need others to give you what God already has given you. Talking about approval. You don't need approval from people that God has already given you. Don't live for the approval of other people. Live for the approval of God. You don't need to live for their approval because God already loves you and accepts you. God's feeling for you don't change if you mess up, if you fall short. And his approval is the only one that really matters. So as we end tonight, I want you to imagine your life. Check this out. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Bow your head. Every head bowed, every eye closed. As we end tonight, I want you to imagine a picture in your head. What would your life look like if you didn't feel the pressure to have to live for the approval of everybody else? So just think about it. What would it look like? What would your life look like if you started to live like God's approval was the only approval that actually mattered? What would your life look like? How much less stressed would you be? How much less fake would life feel? How much less tired and exhausted would you be? How much less worried would you be about if people are going to like you from one day to the next? How much less overwhelmed would you feel if you didn't live for the approval of other people? I want to ask 2 questions tonight and pray us out. The first question is to somebody in the room who knows Jesus. If you're in the room, you know Jesus, you have a relationship with Jesus. You're saved, you have salvation, you have a relationship with God. But if you were to be honest tonight, you would say, Pastor Kaleb, I have a relationship with Jesus, and I am saved from my sins, and I know that heaven is my home. I know that. Would you slip your hand in the air? Slip your hand. I know heaven is my home. I have a relationship with Jesus. It's awesome. It's awesome. Now slip your hand back down. Now I want you to slip your hand back up if you would say, I know heaven's my home, and I know I have a relationship with Jesus, but here's the reality tonight. I live for the approval of people more than I know that I should. Would you slip your hand back up in there and just say, hey, I know that I live for the approval of people. I care about their opinions. I care about what they think. I care about what they say. Keep your hand in there. Almost just as many hands went up to say, hey, I believe in Jesus, but I live for people's approval. You can put your hand back down. I'm going to pray over you in just a moment. The second group of people is if you were to say tonight, I don't know Jesus. I want to talk to you just for a second. I don't know Jesus. I don't know that heaven is my home when I die one day. I don't know what will happen. I don't know if heaven's my home. I don't have a relationship with Jesus. But you would say, you know what, I want to start one, Pastor Kaleb. You know, tonight I didn't realize until tonight that I'm accepted and I'm loved by God, and that I don't have to work for other people's approval, but I get to actually just live in the approval of Jesus Christ because he died on a cross for me. And that's the first time I've ever heard that. And I want a relationship with Jesus, and I want heaven to be my home too. If you would say that's something you want to start, then I want you to just repeat a prayer after me like this. It's the beginning of a long journey. It's a simple start, but it's a long journey after that. And I would be lying to you if I said it was easy. But I will tell you, it's the most rewarding thing that I've ever done in my entire life. And I'm so glad that Jesus Christ is my Savior, and I have a relationship with him. If you want to start a relationship with Jesus tonight, you just pray a simple prayer of faith like this. You can bail out at any point. Just say, God, tonight I recognize that you love me, and I recognize tonight that Jesus died for my sins, and that I can have a relationship with you because he died for me.
Well, hey, I hope you enjoyed the message. I hope that God used it specifically in your life. Regardless of what you're going through, I pray that he used it in your life. We would love for you to join us in person at Grace Student Night, Sunday nights from 6 to 9 p.m. See ya.